You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you guys again. Couple things before we begin. First, a lot of you know that we are putting on our second Rural Family Kids Camp. It's a camp the first full week of August that allows us to take foster kids and give them a camp experience that they pretty much never get. And last year was phenomenal. I went up there. It was so good I tore my Achilles. I'm very excited for that to happen again. However, one of the stipulations for the camp is that we require a professional counselor, a school counselor, someone with a master's of social work or a marriage and family therapy degree to come with us. If we don't have that person, we can't do the camp. And so if you know of anyone, please let us know. Talk to me, talk to Leslie's the camp director. She's right there. Please, if you know of anyone with that degree that might want to come to camp with us the first full week of August, let us know. And that way we can make sure these kids have the experience they deserve. Second, today is the first official day of Matt Kleinhand's sabbatical. Some of you who love bad jokes are sad, and that's okay. He's coming back. So here's the deal. We tend to send one pastor a summer on sabbatical. It's going to be 3 months long, and he's going to be around. He doesn't like leave. We're family here, so he sticks around. So you can like talk to him and stuff when he's on sabbatical. Just don't give him any work to do. Give that to me or to Scott or one of the other pastors that you see, and pray for him. These are pretty formative things that we do them for a reason, and they tend to indirectly but powerfully influence like the life of the church and the way we can care for all of you and each other. And so pray for him while he's gone. I think it's going to be one of those for him too. So that's that. Third thing, we are starting a new series this morning. We're going to spend the summer looking at the miracles of Jesus from one of the gospel accounts of his life. It's a book called John. It's the fourth account of Jesus' life in the New Testament. I want to read you the first one of these miracles. We're going to look at, over the next 10 weeks, we're going to look at one each week. The first one's in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So that's on page 887 of the Red Pew Bible in front of you. It's also on the screen. Here's what it says. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord. Now, this is the first recorded miracle of Jesus, changing water into wine. And as you go through his life, you see more. People who can't walk begin to walk. They're healed. Food is multiplied so people can eat. There's raising from the dead. There's walking on water. There's all kinds of miracles. And we're going to learn from those over the next 10 weeks. And as beautiful and deep and rich as this passage is, I'm not going to preach all of it today. Zach's going to do that next week. Because before we can learn from these miracles, we have to understand them. And we have issues with these miracles these days in a variety of ways. There's 2 main issues. One, we tend to have a hard time believing in miracles, just in general. And then 2, even if you do believe in them, we have a hard time knowing what to do with them. So first, we struggle with the idea of a miracle happening, whether we tend to admit it or not. Christian or not, it can be hard to put stock in some of these stories, and there are reasons for that we do need to explore. But second, we struggle with what they're supposed to mean. Like, even if we do believe them, we're not sure what to do with them. You kind of go, okay, you say, that's really cool that Jesus can do that, and yet is there anything larger to this than like a divine magic trick? Like, what do you do with these stories? And so next week, Zach's going to get to take us through the riches of this particular first sign. And this week, I'm going to focus on that last verse. the idea that this is the first sign Jesus did, that it manifested his glory, and that his disciples then believed in him. And so we're going to split it into two things. I'll try and smuggle in a third, because Brian, but we'll do two. First, how can we believe in miracles in this day and age? And second, what are these miracles supposed to mean about God and Jesus and us? So first, how can we believe in these? And then second, what are they supposed to mean? All right. At the very end of verse 11, Jesus does this miracle, and it says his disciples believed in him. Now, we're going to see, that it means a lot more than this, but at the very basic level, this means the disciples at least believed they had seen a miracle. Like that happened. And that's the struggle for us today, in a nutshell, that we think it's a lot easier for them to believe than it is for us. And imagine if I told you, my friend turned up to a party, and I had some water in my glass, he just went poof, and it was this really good Cabernet. If you heard me say that or someone else say that, your instant reaction, without even thinking about it, is there has to be a natural explanation. Like he does close-up magic. I don't know. Something explains this that's not it being supernatural. And typically that's the first thought we all have. It's not even a thought as much as a reaction. There has to be some natural explanation for this. Because really, that's what we've been doing over the last 500 years as Western people. We've been figuring out that everything people used to think was supernatural actually has a natural explanation. That's been our theme. And so people used to think, that rain fell on your crops when the gods were happy with you. And now we know about barometric pressure and wind patterns and all this stuff, right? And so when we look at accounts like this in the Bible, there's a sort of knee-jerk instant reaction where we go, well, this is a story about how people who chalked up all sorts of things to supernatural forces, this is a story about them. And that's before they understood the natural explanation underneath it all. So to put it simply, if you and I can't believe about a miracle down the street, how are we going to believe one about a miracle 2,000 years ago? Now, there's two very closely related issues here. Some of you, by the way, are like, nah, I'm good, I just believe him. We love you to death. We're glad you're here. Many of us struggle. And there's related issues here. So for you, think about these things and be able to tell your skeptical friends. But for the rest of us, there's two related issues. The first has to do with how we understand the relationship between science and faith. In other words, we tend to think that science has disproved miracles just by track record. So scientific progress has given us enough to work with that we know miracles don't happen, and eventually we'll know why. And this is a really complex topic, science and faith, and I'm not going to hit all of it. And I highly commend to you the summer seminar taught by Jonathan Cow on science and faith. He is much smarter than me, and I encourage you to go see that. However, I got to give you something. So when you think of this sort of thing, this relationship, and the idea that science has kind of disproved miracles, there are a few things we need to recognize. One, science has done a lot of stuff for us. It's phenomenal. Science is awesome. Giant tomatoes that alleviate world hunger, awesome. Go to the moon, awesome. Science has done some pretty amazing things. And yet, it hasn't revealed to us stuff that the disciples didn't understand in terms of the miracles that they saw. We know a lot more now about wine and its chemical composition and the fermentation process, but a really uneducated Palestinian peasant from the turn of the millennium, that millennium, that guy could have told you that water doesn't turn into wine instantly as much as any of us could. People knew that dead people stay dead. They knew that 2 loaves of bread don't make 6. They knew that people don't walk on water. They knew these sorts of things. They know that lame people didn't typically just get up and walk. So it's not like science figured that out for us. Oh, they weren't clear on that. No, they were very clear. And there are plenty of examples of the disciples doubting this stuff. So you have in Matthew 28, the resurrection story. It says the disciples see the risen Jesus. And then it says some of them worshiped and some doubted. And then Thomas, doubting Thomas. I'm not going to believe unless I put my fingers in his sides and where the nails were, this sort of thing. Even when they're like, Jesus, there's not enough food for everyone. None of them are like, just whip up some food, man. Just, magic it up and we'll give them food. They don't have this sense that this stuff just happens all the time. And these things stood out to them because they knew they weren't normal and they couldn't find a natural explanation even though they were looking for one. And interestingly, this is sort of an aside, if you notice, none of them were actually rejected for that doubt. Some of the ones who doubted ended up becoming apostles. And so for God, at least from the Bible's perspective, doubt is an invitation to ask more questions. God invites further inquiry and takes people who doubt and sometimes answers those questions and makes them into apostles, makes them into missionaries and all these people. And so that's one thing. Second, science doesn't rule out miracles because that's not how science works. Now, I am not a scientist, but I know scientists. I know very smart scientists. And what they'll tell you is that essentially science has certain limits to it. There's a story, N.T. Wright's a biblical scholar, and he had this story where a Cambridge guy, so he's at this Cambridge dinner party, which I just imagine almost like a Sherlock Holmes movie. I don't know, that's probably not how it was, but that's how I think of it. And so there's all these guys like kind of in there, and the host of the party was a physician. And so whoever the guy was, they got like Cornish game hens or something. And he's like, okay, looks over at the host and he says, hey, you're a medic. Like, where do I start the incision? And the guy says to him, oh, no, I'm a physician, not a surgeon. All I can do is tell you how it died. In other words, the better you get at your field, the more restricted you realize you can be about what you discuss. And some of the best scientists realize that their field doesn't work in such a way that they can make sweeping claims about all of reality. Only what science is really good at and what it's for, which is testing observable, natural hypotheses. That's what it does. And it's phenomenal at it, and I love it. But there are people who try and push it past that. So there's a guy named John Macquarie. He wrote this. He's arguing why science means you can't believe in miracles. He says, science proceeds on the assumption that whatever events occur in the world can be accounted for in terms of other events that are just as much of this world. And so miracles are irreconcilable with our modern understanding of both science and history. Now, there's a Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, a pretty famous philosopher worldwide, and he picked this up. And he said, Macquarie might mean to suggest that just practicing science requires you reject the idea of God, for example, raising someone from the dead. But unfortunately, this argument is like the drunk who insists on looking for his lost car keys only under the streetlight because the light's better there. In fact, it would do the drunk one better. It would insist that because the keys would be hard to find in the dark, they must be under the light. And this is what tends to happen is when people, typically not the best scientists, but some people who are enamored with science, tend to overreach. They tend to say things like, because science can't locate the supernatural must not exist. And that's exactly what some of the best scientists say is not true, because that's not what science does. In fact, many world-class scientists are themselves Christians and believe in miracles, sometimes because of their scientific expertise. And I don't have time to go through all of this, but Francis Collins runs the Human Genome Project. He's a Christian. I have people from all over the world. The Cambridge professor of experimental physics is Russell Calburn. He's a Christian. Hans Halvorson is Princeton. He's a philosopher of science, really widely respected. He's a Christian. Jeff Schwartz is like next door at UCLA. He's a really, really well-known neuroscientist, Christian. William Phillips won the Nobel Prize in physics. And he said, I see an orderly, beautiful universe that, had it been constructed slightly differently, would never have given birth to stars and planets, let alone bacteria and people. And there's no good, purely scientific reason for why the universe shouldn't have been different. And so many good scientists have concluded from these observations that an intelligent God must have chosen to create the universe with such beautiful, simple, and life-giving properties. And from the other side, Stephen Jay Gould, atheist evolutionary scientist, he said once, well, either I have to believe that 50% of my colleagues are just absolute idiots, or I have to believe that modern science can coexist with normal religious convictions. It's one or the other, as well as with atheistic convictions. He's simply saying science can only do so much for us in this topic. And so many of these folks recognize at their best that for a long time, science had its origins in Christian thought, the idea of a God that orchestrated things where there would be natural laws, there would be things that are consistent across the universe, there would be a sense of equilibrium that exists, there would be a repeatability in terms of experiments. And so for a lot of people, even today, Jonathan Sacks sees this stuff as complementary disciplines, science and faith. He said, science takes things apart to figure out how they work, religion puts things together to figure out what they mean. That's pretty good. Now, much more to be said. Go to Jonathan's seminar. I think he's here. I'm embarrassing him. There he is. Yeah, sorry, Jonathan. But you should go to his seminar, though. So, in other words, bottom line, you can't rule out supernatural stuff just because you think science won a fight it was never fighting. So you can't just rule it out. Now, here's the thing, though. That's the first related thing. There's a second one. That did almost nothing for most of you, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure for none of you were, I don't know, maybe some of you it did. Some of you were like, okay, and it's good to know and it's helpful and it sets things. But at some point you're kind of like, yeah, I'm still where I started. It's nice to know that, but I'm right where I started. And here's why. There's a second issue at work, which I think is actually much more powerful. For many people, including many Christians, when you hear about a miraculous account in the Bible, or elsewhere, I suppose, you don't immediately think of specific scientific arguments as to why it's not true. It just feels hard to believe, doesn't it? Like at some level, it's not because you have this worked out silly, it just feels hard. It feels very difficult. Now, on the one hand, that's kind of the definition of a miracle, like that it would be hard to, it's not something that, if it wasn't kind of hard to believe and rare, it would be like a Tuesday. So like, if you need miraculous proof of the existence of miracles, you've really gotten yourself into a pickle. And so this is going to be difficult. At the same time, what I want to explore, and what I think is important to explore, and what touches down in your life, I think, whether you consider yourself someone who's skeptical or scientific or not, is this feeling, this way that even for Christians who believe in miracles, you feel like you do over just some kind of internal protest. There's this sense, the internal architecture of the way Christians view the world and the way non-Christians view the world, it's actually very similar in this regard. It's just that Christians, for all of us, miracles are difficult to believe, but for Christians, we just happen to believe them anyway. That's what kind of tends to happen. Now, my question is that appropriate? Is that how it's supposed to feel? Is there a way to see the existence of miracles not as concessions, but as things that actually fit into the way the world is, that fit with reality? And that used to be the case for like most of human history. You have the disciples who, on the one hand, are able to be skeptical, to doubt that, Jesus was raised from the dead and all these other miracles, and at the same time, not be completely rejecting outright the idea that God could act in the world in which we live. They were able to do both. Why in the last 500 years can we only do one of those? Is that how it's supposed to be? Okay, there's a story here, and it's long and convoluted, and if any of you have degrees in any of the areas I'm going to touch on, you're going to think I'm hopelessly simplistic, and I agree with you, and it grates against me in my heart. So, that being said, here's a story. About 500 years, I'm using 500 years really loosely, but about 500 years ago, we started to make very incredible scientific and technological progress. We essentially discovered, Francis Bacon did this stuff, and we started calling it the scientific method, this way of understanding the world around us with a level of detail that we'd never had before. And so instead of just looking at things sort of as they were and taking them as given, we began to have the mental tools, the technical tools, the technique tools, to say, let's figure out more about what this is. And so you run experiments, you have hypotheses, you do these sorts of things, this scientific method stuff. And we get this detail back where we go, we understand far more than we did about this thing than we did, for thousands of years. And it was absolutely intoxicating for us. Now, I say us, I mean people in the West. There was a lot going on in the East that had parallels, but time. So we'll just stick with the West here. It was intoxicating for us. And you paired it with a bunch of other social and cultural and political and spiritual issues that were happening around that same time, and it created this new sense in us. We began to think that we were getting in touch with reality for like the first time. Like we were really engaging with reality for the first time kind of ever. And we started to think that the things we found through the scientific method, through testing and repeatability and sensory experience and these sorts of things, were sort of more real than anything else that humans had experienced up to that point. And to the level that those things that we couldn't find out through the scientific method, that weren't testable and repeatable and all these things, that those things, we started to think that those were actually getting in the way of understanding reality. Those are now, obscuring what reality's really, what things are real and what aren't. And so today, you end up in a situation, again, really simple, but I think it's true. You end up in a situation where things just feel more real to us when they're observable and repeatable. Like if I can see it or touch it or test for it and repeat that, then I can be confident that it's real and I can count on it. And if things fit into that paradigm then, if you can touch it, taste it, see it, test for it, we give those things a pass and we say things like, that's really real. That's like baseline, confident, real. And everything else, no matter what it is, just feels fuzzier, looser, harder to define, harder to trust in. And so now, after all of that story, we sit here and you hear Jesus performed a miracle, and our internal reaction is, that just doesn't fit with reality, with the way the world is. Before you had to think about it, there's this reaction that doesn't fit. It's not what the world is like. And that's why it's fascinating to me. Up until about 500 years ago, it required significant effort to believe there was no God. Just about across human experience. You had to try. You had to work on it. You had to say, I'm trusting the arguments. But in the last 500 years, it's the exact opposite. Now, having faith is something you hold on to because it might just escape. It takes effort to stay believing. It takes effort to believe in miracles. What happened? This story happened. We went through a process where we begin to think that the only things that are actually real are things we can touch, taste, see, test for, and nothing really else qualifies. And so we have an internal bent now to where these things they just can't happen. So it's not that you're sitting around rehearsing scientific arguments. You just have this internal disposition that says, it's really hard for me to buy it because we've been through this process. Now, there are problems with that. We can't go into all of them, but there are really significant problems with that. One of the main ones is this. There are things in life that you and I believe are real that we cannot test for. You absolutely cannot test for justice. And yet you believe it's real. You believe there's a right and a wrong. You believe morality is a thing, not just sort of an experience you happen to have. You think it's something that's real. Love is something that we would say exists. It's its own thing. It's real. There's a confidence in that, and you can't test for it. It's not like repeatable. There's no molecules for it. Beauty is something we'd say is both in the eye of the beholder and yet real. It's a real thing. You can't just ignore it. It can't be nothing. It can't be unreal. So there are these things, science can't create or measure these things, and yet we struggle to say they aren't real. And now, you know me, I got to qualify all that. So here's what ends up happening is we look at that, and that internal bent kicks in, and we say, okay, and we've read an article in the last 15 years in some magazine, some newspaper, somewhere online, some Facebook link someone posted, and it's about how, what we found out is that when you have an experience of beauty or an experience of justice or morality or someone ought to do this, these kinds of things, that really this part of your brain is like highlighted and it's active and this is happening and it's all sort of this, it's really this kind of biological thing that happens to us. And there's this piece of you that goes, oh, there's the natural explanation, except you hadn't thought about that near at all. You just were glad that it fit in with that internal little bit of you. Oh, cool. Because two things. One, of course your brain's going to light up when you feel things. What did you think was going to happen? Like, that doesn't mean it's only biological. It doesn't mean it's only what it is, because guess what? If it's only biological, if it's only just some random happenstance in your brain that exists because of a random happenstance of molecule collection that exists because of a bunch of other random stuff that created this situation we're in now, then you can't trust any of that to lead you to any kind of truth whatsoever. Why in the world, if all there is a bunch of molecules bouncing around essentially at random by accident, do you think that your thought process is geared to put you in touch with how things really are? Wouldn't it be much more logical to suggest that your thought process, if it's just a bunch of random stuff and there's nothing real but what you can test for, is just kind of whatever worked out? I don't know, just happened to happen. Who's to say that you and I can say anything and argue, and that our reason works, that our brain works to put us in touch with any kind of truth, or beauty, or justice, or all those things. When you talk about something being beautiful, you're not talking about how it happens to make you feel. You're talking about something you think is real. When you see injustice, you're not talking about an experience you happen to have. When you go to the Holocaust Museum, you don't walk out going, what an interesting internal experience that has no significance. You walk out saying something's real. And so there's no way to downsize that. There's no way to restrict that back into biology. You just can't do it. And so what you end up is this situation where if you're prepared to talk, to live, to exist, to trust that justice, beauty, love, things like this are real, even though you can't test for them, why aren't we prepared to talk about other things as being real, even though we can't test for them, like God or miracles or things like that? This ends up being the situation we find ourselves in. Now, that might not have helped either. Then a couple things now. Here's why. Joseph Minich says he's getting a doctorate in intellectual history at the University of Texas, which just sounds so fancy. But he's a very intelligent guy. He wrote a book called Enduring Divine Absence. Wonderful title. And his question is twofold. One, what I said earlier, why in the world did people, for most of human history, look around and just say there must be a God, and it was hard to disbelieve that? How do we transition to now where everyone's just like, well, there must not, that the default position is there's not a God, and it's hard to believe? What happened? Why do we see divine absence now where we saw divine presence for so many thousands of years? And then the second question is, and why does this almost exclusively happen in places that are rich? He said, go around the world right now. Religion is not going away anywhere. The only place it's dipping is in first world areas that are typically educated. He's like, what in the world is going on? Now, his answer is this. I think it's helpful. And I think it gets at the reason. Okay, look, the first two things didn't help you, and it's very dense, and it's Brian doing his philosophy thing. Fair enough. This one is important because it affects you whether you think it affects you or not. I think his answer is right. He says the reason is because science isn't like this poisonous thing that got in and messed up with us. It's because science gave us control. Technology gave us control. And in rich first world areas, we have more control than anywhere else. We have so much control that we don't have to look around at nature and see something bigger than us, that endures longer than us. We have now been taught to look at nature as raw materials that we can use for our purposes. And when that happens, you begin to think that the only things that are real are the things that are raw materials. In other words, what he's saying is essentially that the more we distance ourselves from being a part of creation and find ourselves controlling creation, the more you're conditioned to think that the only real things in the universe are the things you can touch, taste, see, and use for your purposes. And so, he tells the same story I told you. Like, we find the scientific method and we say, now I can find reality. When what really happened, he says, is we got really good at looking at one part of reality. And then as we begin to harness that information and manipulate the world, like he'd blame Henry Ford more than any of the philosophers. As we manipulate the world around us, we begin to think, we've discovered that reality is just at its base a bunch of stuff that we can move around as we see fit. And the more we move it around, the more we think we've gotten in touch with the way things really are. Because look, I'm moving it, I'm touching it, I'm doing it. And then when in fact we've just gotten much better at interacting with that one part of reality. And so the psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And we say, nah, Mars is a big rock. And some of us are like, we're going to colonize it. It's going to be awesome. The Bible talks about how the mountains declare God's righteousness, and teach us about how small we are. And we say, nah, that's just this thing we dig up to get jewelry and batteries for our electric cars. And at some point, look around the room. We live in a place where everything has been constructed by a human hand. Nothing is in its original state. And he says, we have designed this place for its purpose. He says, you can't think that's not going to affect the way you look at the world and reality and what it is. If you never get out from that, he says, you're restricted to look at one part of reality and never look out at the whole. And that's why we end up being people who look around at a bunch of constructed things and highways and roads and parks where we choose where the trees go and how high they grow. And we get there and we say things like, you know what, love must just be some brain chemistry moving around. That's what makes us those kind of people. It cuts us off. There's this narrative that says that, around the Enlightenment, what happened is we were like a child that finally grew up and left our room and went out into the wide world and said, I don't need the authority of my parents. I can discover the world on my own. And Minich says, no. What happened is you were a kid that didn't like the world out there, and so you locked yourself in the room and convinced yourself this is all there is. That's not. You got to leave your room. Or, more appropriately, phones. So there, I have one. Because I'm caught up. I'm going to tweet something. There are videos of people where they're looking at their phones and then something horrible happens. And horribly embarrassing. Not horrible. But they're looking at their phone, they bump into a tree or another person. I saw one where they walked just straight into a koi pond. It's like, and what's fascinating about that is, to me, so you look at that, you watch it, it's so funny because look at these people, they're looking at their phones, whatever. What's interesting to me is that people blame them, like, you were checked out from reality. They weren't. They were doing something on their phone. They were texting someone. That's real. They were reading a news article. That's real. They were accessing reality through their phone. It's true. You can't say it's not. Even if they're crushing candy, they're doing something. There's something happening on their phone, right? So they're doing this thing, and they're going along. The problem is they had limited their awareness of reality to what was going through here. And they forgot there's more going on, some of which was coming at them faster than they realized. Now, in the same way, what Joseph Minich is saying, I would say what the witness of the Bible is to our time in history is that we have begun to reduce reality into what can fit right in front of us, into what we can touch and taste and see, and we have a very difficult time denying it, and we have to look up at the other parts of reality, some of which are coming at us faster than we realize. That helps. Because what that means is, and I think this is why people camp. I'm not a camper. But you go out and you go into nature and you realize you're small. Problem is now we camp and you bring, your tent and your sleeping bag. And there's no danger. It's very rare for us to do this, but we need to find ways to look up from the phone and realize the world we actually live in, not the room we've locked ourselves in and convinced ourselves that we know everything. We've got this all hammered out. Otherwise, if we never do that, you will have all the arguments in the world for why God is real and you should believe in him. And there are good ones. But it just won't feel that way. It'll always feel like a concession to you. That's not because he's not there. It's because you closed the door. You can't get your eyes off your phone. And that's why we tend not to believe in miracles, why it feels that way. And so lots that we could take from there. I wish I could speak more about that, but I can't because of time. And because the Bible is important, and this is all sort of precursor to the verse that I have, which is John 2:11. Now, that was number one. How can you believe in miracles this day and age? That's a lot, very dense. I hope it's helpful. Number two, which will be shorter, because in a sense, the question of what do these miracles mean is what the series is going to be about. We're going to do this weeks and weeks in a row, but it's helpful to know going in because there are ways we see miracles wrong. You read a miracle, and the typical way we read it, most of the time, is we never say this, but it's a magic trick. Not a fake one, a real one. And like any magician, you see a magician show, what they do is they have a bunch of cool things they do, and they tend to structure them in a certain way where there's no relation between them except that you want the coolest one at the end. That's how it works. Like a fireworks show. You don't do the finale at the beginning, right? You do it at the end. So you have this, there's a cool one, here's a cooler one, this one's kind of as cool, then there's a really cool one, then there's the coolest one at the end, and they have no relationship to each other besides that they were cool. And so you read the miracles and you kind of go, is that what this is? Water into wine, that's cool. Healing a lame guy, that's cool. Okay, and they're all, biggest one, resurrection at the end, yeah, coolest. Is that the relationship? Not really. What you end up having is, let me back up a second. What that does is it hurts your ability to understand them just in your personal Bible reading. Like you read about, Jesus turned water into wine. Jesus helped a lame guy walk again. What do I do with that? And you start going, so does that mean he's really powerful and going to heal everyone? It's no, because that's not happening. Not everyone's getting healed right now. I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to expect a Merlot out of my Brita filter anytime soon. That's probably not what this is about. Maybe, and this is where I think we land, maybe I'm just supposed to sort of be impressed. Okay. And sorta, yeah. I guess it's impressive what he's doing, but there's more to it than that. Because what's interesting is that the Bible doesn't use, there's no word in the original language for miracle. Our word miracle is a word that we sort of use in a certain way ever since about 500 years ago, because we defined it in interesting ways and all this stuff. In the Bible, there's words, one of the main ones that you see is the word for ability, an exercise of authority, powerful authority being put to work. That's often translated miracle. In the book of John, you have the word sign. He says these miracles are signs. In other words, they're not ends in themselves. They're not magic tricks. They're not just raw shows of power that are supposed to impress you. They're things that are supposed to point you to something beyond themselves. Just think of a road sign. If you're going on the Santa Monica freeway, you get on the 10 and you're in Culver City or something. You get on the Santa Monica freeway and you see the sign that says Santa Monica. You don't get to the sign and go, sweet, where's the Ferris wheel? No, this is a sign you're supposed to go somewhere because of this. And in the same way, these miracles tell you where you need to go. And now where are they pointing? Well, in John 2:11 it says they're pointing to two things. They're pointing to Jesus' glory, to God's glory through Jesus Christ, and to belief in him. In other words, they show us who God is, his glory, and why we should trust him over other things. That's belief. So first, they point you to his glory, who God is. We've talked about this before. Glory is a tough word to work with because it's expansive. It's like holy. It just means it's a big word. But glory at its root in the original language means weight. Weight in the sense of significance. So you think of weight, glory is something where when it touches down, it creates ripples, it offsets, it adjusts. So, when they test bridges, they put them through these stress tests with wind and different things. Essentially, they're pushing weight on these bridges. And if you see some of them sometimes, they roll. And apparently it's supposed to do that, but it looks super freaky. But that's the idea, is that when you put something significant enough, something weighty enough down, it shifts everything around it. And that's the idea behind the glory being manifested here, is that Jesus shows up and he touches down, and these miracles demonstrate his weight, his significance, and the shape that weight and significance is in. So one of the first things the miracles show you about God's glory is that this is not a God that just sort of shows up and says, hey, hope you're doing well. Can I help with anything? This is a God who shows up and says, my weight transforms every single aspect of your world and your life. And when you come, that's why for a lot of the miracles, when the disciples come face to face with it, they get scared. Like the end of the calming of the storm. It's really funny. They're scared of the storm. Then Jesus calms the storm, and then they're more scared. It actually says they're more terrified. Why? Because if he can do stuff like this, what's he going to do with your life? He doesn't touch down just to sort of high five and move on. This is Jesus. This is the manifesting his glory, his weight, his significance. But what shape is that in? Well, it's interesting. You have these miracles that they're typically broken down into categories. Like there's miracles of provision, like feeding the 5,000. There's miracles of reversal, like raising the dead. There's miracles of healing, like all these sorts of things, right? And now C.S. Lewis wrote a little book conveniently called Miracles, which is quite good. If you have, it's not that long. If you have it, I'd recommend it. Have the time, I'd recommend it. But what he says is he sees all that and he says, I would actually want to adjust them. I'd want to see two main categories of miracles: miracles of old creation and miracles of new creation. And he says miracles of old creation are essentially just what God is doing, except what God is always doing, except faster, which is just a fascinating concept. We tend to think of miracles, again, because of our weird definition of the word from several hundred years ago, we tend to think of miracles as these things where there's the laws of nature, everything's going, and then God comes in and smacks something, and then he leaves. Comes in and resets a bone, and he's out of there. Fixes the spine, and then he bounces. That's not how the Bible would conceive of these things. The Bible would say that, look, God is always making wine. How does wine get made? We know the laws about it. We know the timing and the chemistry of it. How does it actually happen? The Bible would say that this is what God does. It takes him about a year, normally. You ferment stuff, the grapes grow and stuff. It takes about a year. And so this miracle of water into wine is an example of what God is always doing, but does faster, in a moment. It's the same with all sorts of other things that you see. God is always making bread. He's always feeding people. We talk about it with the concept of vocations and callings, that your work is a means God uses to help people and serve people. He's always making bread. It takes him some time, about a season. Then there's the milling and stuff. This time he just did it faster. It's the same mechanism, just faster. And so C.S. Lewis is the first thing about his glory, the shape of it you see when he lands, is that he lands in and he says, let me show you what I'm already doing. They point you to his glory in what he's constantly doing, and now, in a sense, if we can speak this way, in person, is doing in front of your eyes. He's this kind of God with this kind of weight. And so the miracles in that sense are this kind of snapshot of what he's doing in all of creation right now. He's constantly doing miracles in that sense. They're not as fast. And that points you to his glory, to his size, to his weight. But then Lewis says there's miracles of new creation. He says these are the miracles of healing, of walking on water, of raising Lazarus from the dead. He says these aren't what he's already doing in the creation that he's done, or that he's made. These are snapshots of what he's going to do in a new creation. This is what the future looks like when he has this much weight. And that's why you see things like healing. You see him saying, I'm going to knit together the brokenness. Things like raising from the dead. I'm going to undo death. Things like walking on water. You're going to have an entirely new relationship with nature, he says, in a new creation. It's still water in a sense. It has these similarities, these overlaps. It's still the same person but they're entirely different somehow too. This is what do you see in this glory? All of it's showing God's glory. This is who God is. The weightiness touches down and shows you, I am the one who can rework your life, because see what I have done and see what I will do. It points you to something. But it's not just appreciation of that. It points you to ultimately belief. Now, we said earlier that idea of belief was, at its its rawest form, it has to start with thinking they actually happened. But belief in the Bible is never just that. That's way too limited. When John says the disciples believed, he's not saying they believed it happened intellectually. He's saying, and the word technically means, that they put their trust in him. There was a trusting that resulted because of their understanding of what happened. And so the idea is that these things point you to Jesus in a way that you hadn't seen before. So that whatever you were trusting for provision, for satisfaction, for life, for hope, for what tomorrow is going to hold, you realize all of those fall very short. And you say, I've got to put my trust in him instead. There are things that come at you. They come at you. There's suffering, and there is sickness, and there is death, and more. And when you look at these things, what the miracles do is they show you Jesus has the weight to show you that those things don't have final authority. They don't outweigh him. They do not have sufficient glory to overrule him. That ultimately, he is the one that has the final word, and so he's the one you've got to trust to shape your life, to follow, to do whatever he says. At some level, that's what a Christian is. You can talk about being a Christian in two different ways, maybe more, but we'll go with two. One is essentially what it means to become a Christian, the set of beliefs, understandings, internal dispositions that happen and that must happen. And that's essentially about what God does for you and not what you do for him. Being a Christian means that God has saved you, not that you've saved yourself. And yet there's the lived experience of it, sort of the existential side of being a Christian. And that experience typically runs on the lines of you looking at Jesus Christ as he's portrayed in the Gospels, as the Holy Spirit interacts with your life, and you looking at him and saying, I lay my sword down, command me, I'm yours. You're big enough, you're weighty enough, you're glorious enough. I'll do whatever you say. I'll go wherever you go. I'd do anything to be with you. That's the lived experience of it. Now, in a sense, they're overlapping. You can see why, because the reason that second one happens is because the first one is about his grace and not about your effort. If it's about your effort, the second one would just be, I'm going to try really hard, I'm going to do whatever I can, I'm going to try and keep some things for myself, but I'm going to, it'd be all those things. But if it really is his grace that does it, if it really is Jesus Christ's death on the cross that saves you, then at some level, it produces the second one, where you see the beauty of that, and you say, you're glorious enough, you're weighty enough, you're significant enough, you're bigger than anything else in the world, in my life, you're bigger than me. Tell me what to do, I'll go anywhere. That's the experience. And the miracles point you to that. That's the shape of his glory, and therefore, that's the response of belief. But there's more. I mean, the other thing the miracles do is they show you God's concern for your life. It's fascinating. We don't have time to get into, I love John 2, and I love all these passages, and they have these thick, rich, thematic connections and these amazing things that you see in the way that God knit this whole thing together. And yet, they also have just in the middle of them that God wanted to make wine for this guy at a wedding because he was going to get embarrassed. Like it was shameful in that culture to not have enough wine. And Jesus went, well, it's not, I don't know, it's not really supposed to be doing anything yet, but okay. I mean, obviously it's more than that. But do you see, in the middle of it, that's there too. That Jesus could have very easily sent 5,000 people away to get their own lunch and said, no, I'll do it. Are you hungry? Like, I'd love to do that. The God that has that weight that you say, command me, that you say, the glory is life-shaking and soul-altering, is the same God that looks back at you and says, are you hungry? Like, can I take care of you? I don't want you to be embarrassed. I don't want you to not have things that are good for you. I want to be a good parent to you. I want to lead you well. I want to care about you. It's the same God. And in that sense, what's the point of the miracles? What do they mean? Well, they mean he's that weighty and that good. And so you trust him. Believe in him. The other stuff will let you down. The other stuff will not command your life well, and you definitely will not command your life very well. But if you look at him and say, let's go on an adventure, I'll go wherever you want, he will take care of you in fascinating and often counterintuitive ways, but he will. And in that sense, the miracles become one of the best highlights for the end of all the gospel accounts, for the crucifixion. It's funny, if you give, in America, even now we have some sense, if you ask people, hey, did Jesus live like a long life? They would say no. Like they might not know a lot, but they know he died relatively young. And they know the crucifixion thing, they might not know a lot of the details about it, but in America and in the West, there's still some sense of that. But if you go to other cultures where the Bible's not very known and they're reading it for the first time, it's amazing to watch their faces when they get to the end. Because their mind is blown. Like all they've done, especially in cultures that have more power like dynamics than we do in terms of like supernatural forces, they're just like, this guy is throwing down. Like he's casting out demons, he's making food for people, he's doing people want to make him king, he just like walks through them. Like whatever that means, whatever miracle that was. We're not covering that one, by the way. But he's just, and they're like, this is intense. This is insane what this guy's doing. And so by the end, he's on the cross, and they're just flabbergasted. What in the world is going on? It makes no sense. And that's to some degree why the gospel authors include the parts of the story where they have passerbys look up at the cross and say, here's this Jesus. You did all these miracles. You raised Lazarus from the dead. Why can't you save yourself? There's a reason you're supposed to be flabbergasted. And that's that these miracles show you that his death was not something that happened to him because some people chose it. His death is something that happened to him because he chose it. He could have gotten down, and I think we all know that at some level. But he didn't. Why not? Well, the answers are thorough and deep and rich and wide. But for the glory of God, in love for you. That's why he didn't get down. So every time you look at the miracle, it's one more way of pointing to the glory that says that this guy who could do all this chose not to use any of that power so you could be saved. It also shows you how deep your sins must have been. If someone who could do all this still chose to get up on the cross, what does it mean that it was required of you? And yet he would do it. Now what does it mean that he did? And so you find him basically robbed of all the things he provided. The provision of food, the provision of healing, the provision of life. He's providing those things to everyone else, and he's robbed of them himself on the cross. All why? So we might be able to have life in his name. That's what the signs say at the end of the book of John. It's our benediction. John writes these signs down, so we might believe in him and have life in his name. In other words, so that we might be people who become attached to Jesus Christ with that kind of weight and that kind of glory, who follow him wherever he goes and knows that he's going to lead us through old creation, in provision, and love, and goodness, into a new creation, where death doesn't reign anymore, where eternal life is real. It's an amazing thing he does, and that's what we get to look at, and that's what we ought to do. Ourselves, in this man-created room, look up and away at what the world is really like, and then see that what he tells us about that, what he shows us about that, is a kind of weight and glory and love that we never would have hoped for and never could have seen if we kept staring at our phones. Okay, let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.